Capital Record, where we defend free enterprise and capital markets because we believe in the dignity of the human person. Hello and welcome to David Bonson's Capital Record, brought to you by National Review, where we obsess over the free and virtuous society, try to apply those things in a couple podcasts a week to the topics of the day, various real-life economic application. And I've talked a lot over the years in Capital Record about how housing is front and center with anyone that is looking at applying economic principles and policy to things that matter in a free society. There are very few things. You could talk about tax rates, and you could talk about jobs, and a number of various elements that are somewhat universal in how democratized they are to impacting society. Housing is near the top of that list. There are topics that will come up in this podcast around private equity or around various elements of capital markets that might be more granular that I think are extremely important and have a big macro and micro impact, but would be maybe less democratic in how people feel it day by day. Housing isn't one of those things. When I spoke in our last episode about the nasty things that had been said about the CEO of Blackstone Real Estate who had been killed a couple weeks ago, and how important it is that we defend private equity's role in housing and in rental income properties and things of that nature. I'm not doing it to appeal to a granular capital markets point as much as to point out where that granular capital markets point matters to a large number of people. It has a big impact. The broad subject of housing affordability is nearly universal. And that for that reason, smart would-be political candidates, presidential candidates in 2028 are already talking about it. And that's the subject of Capital Record for our next few minutes today. Rahm Emanuel, who was the chief of staff in the Obama administration, had been a congressman in Illinois and then ended up being the mayor of the great city of Chicago, is trying to carve out a place as a sort of moderate Democrat in 28, where he will maintain a center-left positioning in his brand as a candidate, but run against some of the really politically vulnerable positions of the far-left Democratic progressives, including some that failed candidate Kamala Harris staked out around transgenderism, around DEI, around woke stuff. So there's a lot about Rahm Emanuel that a center-right, Burkean, Buckleyite conservative like me would like more than I would in a person like Kamala Harris or Bernie Sanders or the AOC or whatever. The reason I bring up Rahm Emanuel is he put an op-ed out in the Washington Post that I expected was going to be the type of thing that a guy like me would like more than what I generally would see from today's progressive Democratic Party. And he wanted to make the case that, young men, if we want to quit worrying about why people listening to Joe Rogan's podcast or Theo Von's podcast liked Donald Trump, we need to find issues that appeal to young men, and housing is a big one of those. I don't have any expertise in what the politics of all this are. I barely care about it. It usually makes me cringe a little when I hear people talk about how if we could be cool on this podcast, we'll get young people to vote for us. I think those things happen organically at times. They've happened for President Trump in some ways. They had happened in a different format with President Obama years ago. I mean, there is stuff that happens that I'm no expert in. I'm not an expert in anything connected to the word cool by definition. But I guess this issue that, anyone on a pedestrian level could say of, we would like to find issues that we have something to say to that appeal to a lot of the young men that are not voting with our party. I get that. So I read Rahm Emanuel's article with great interest, and there's a couple of things that I want to quote from, because I really do believe that he gave a very confused explanation about one thing that bothered me a lot after a really good setup. The good premise is housing unaffordability is a big problem, and if a party can speak to it politically, they have a good chance of building resonance with this particular demographic. Fair enough. I think that culturally, economically, and I suppose politically, that there is a really big problem with housing affordability that bothers me. and my quest for a free and virtuous society. And so it stands to reason that there is some opportunity here to get this right. But one of the things he did is give a very confused explanation as to where a lot of this came from. And then he went on to give, I think, a couple solutions that I think are also problematic. And I want to address those in our few minutes here today. I'm going to quote him word for word so I don't mess this up at all. He talked about the financial crisis in 2008. And a lot of young men today now see that they can't afford houses, and they look back to what happened in the financial crisis. And he says, that challenge didn't emerge overnight. To understand its roots, so he's talking about the challenge of today's housing affordability and people's frustration. Look no further than the 2008 financial crisis. As the mortgage bubble burst, millions of families lost their homes explicitly because Wall Street had rigged the system. And yet the bankers who participated in the rigging demanded their annual bonuses and in most cases received them. As White House Chief of Staff under Obama, I advocated, basically put for Old Testament justice. I wanted to hold the bankers who sold these loans accountable. My friends, there is absolutely nothing about what he just said that is true. Nothing. The millions of families lost their homes because they didn't pay for them. And what Wall Street did that was inexplicable and totally unforgivable was in how they levered up those loans on their own balance sheets, putting their creditors at risk, their equity holders at risk, the macro economy at risk. But by them loaning that money and leveraging those loans, meaning they believed in the borrowers, they did not create the problem of people losing their homes. People lost their homes because they took on a loan they couldn't afford. In a lot of cases, they lied through their teeth about their income and assets to support the loan. Now, they did lie through their teeth in a system that allowed them to lie through their teeth. They called them liar loans, okay? So like the ninja loans, no income, no job, no asset, liar loans. It's true that the system was allowing people to do it. But I wrote a book called Crisis of Responsibility because I reject this narrative, and we cannot now, 18 years later, 17 years later, do revisionist history. Wall Street was preposterous in their stewardship of their own capital and the systemic risk that their foolishness created, but they didn't rig the system to make people default on loans. People defaulted on loans because they didn't pay for their homes. And as my data shows in Crisis of Responsibility, there were some people that got in over their heads and couldn't afford it, but the vast majority of defaults and foreclosures and various strategic defaults were basically done by people who could afford to keep making the payment. But when the bubble of escalating home prices ended, they were upside down in what they owed on a home relative to value, so they gave the home back. There was not a financial crisis just from people that had lost jobs, couldn't afford the home. The financial crisis was a byproduct of the heavy amount of people that decided to walk away from houses they could afford. And I'm not going to write a book saying Main Street rigged the system, but I'm not going to write a book saying those bankers rigged the system or that they should go to jail. Go to jail for loaning money to people who didn't pay it back? It's the... And Rahm Emanuel knows darn well why none of them went to jail. You don't think Eric Holder, the attorney general at the time, or Barack Obama would have wanted to send people to jail that committed crimes? What they did to some of the Wall Street companies was absolutely tyrannical. They would have loved to have the benefit of prosecutions. They did, by the way, try to criminally prosecute a couple hedge fund managers at Bear Stearns. They were acquitted by a jury. They went to jury trial and won. And then DOJ wisely said, we're not going to get embarrassed again. There were not criminal cases to be brought, and Rahm Emanuel knows it. But I don't care to defend Wall Street here. What I care to say is Wall Street screwed up Wall Street, and Main Street screwed up Main Street. And desiring us versus them narrative is convenient politically for Rahm Emanuel, but it is not what is needed for young men. What is needed for young men is not more people to blame your problems on. What is needed for young men is to get rid of the crisis of responsibility. And don't blame a banker or an executive at Wall Street for the fact that you couldn't afford a home you took a loan for. And now, 18 years later, there are real problems with housing affordability that are not these young men's fault. And so to try to find a boogeyman for it from the past around a narrative that is class warfare and revisionist driven is silly. He goes on to say, as far as solutions, first, as much as we treat veterans as a population apart when it comes to home buying, we should treat first-time home buyers as their own class. Oh, what in the heck? Veterans that go and serve our country at war to defend our freedoms and risk life and limb, and then have certain governmental home buying programs that we should treat first-time home buyers the same way. Their special class status is because they want to buy an expensive product. I have no problem at all with people buying a first-time home, but to equate it to veterans as a matter of public policy is a really bizarre thing to say. To make it easier for them to reach that first crucial rung on the ladder to economic prosperity, we should reinstitute the Obama administration's $8,000 home buyers tax credit and triple it. Okay, so for those that don't have their calculator handy, give people a $24,000 tax credit to reflect present market conditions and index it to inflation. Second, we should explore ways to make it possible for first-time homebuyers to take out mortgages at favorable interest rates. I'm sorry. Where have I heard this before? He wants to talk about what caused the financial crisis and Old Testament justice for bankers. Giving favorable loans to people that can't afford them is what caused the crisis to begin with. This is the weirdest thing I've ever heard. If they can qualify for the loan, if they are a good borrower, then we don't need the government to give them favorable conditions, favorable rates, because that's what banks do for a living, is loan money to people. So they're going to have no problem getting a loan. If they're a good borrower, you want them to get a loan, and guess what? They'll get it. And if they're a bad borrower, you don't want them to get a loan, whether it's insufficient income, loan-to-value ratios, credit history. There's reasons that someone become good credit risks or bad credit risks. This is not rocket science. Rahm Emanuel's a very smart guy. He worked for an investment bank after he's in Congress. He has really, really good ideas on certain things. This is rank populist pandering that is so disconnected from history and from cogent policy, it frightens me. I probably wasn't going to vote for Rahm Emanuel anyways. But if somehow Rahm Emanuel ended up the candidate in 2028, I'm afraid he just lost my vote. The financial crisis was caused in some part by the things he's now proposing as a solution going forward. The need of the hour is not special tax credits to incentivize people doing something. We have to address the supply problem. It is not a demand problem. The affordability issue is always solved in market conditions. Equalize supply to demand, form equilibrium between supply and demand, and prices right size. They're too expensive right now, and they will come down as there are more motivated sellers, but motivated sellers are hard to find because they got really low interest rates when they bought, and they don't want to sell and then go buy at higher interest rates. So there's a monetary policy component, and as we've highlighted on this podcast, with Barry Habib and with Ed Pinto and others. This is a supply-oriented issue to build new housing stock that is necessary. And how we got a deficiency of supply is a complicated subject. It's somewhat sociological, social, cultural, but it's also very much policy-driven. And there were economic issues too. For one thing, not enough capital coming in to building new supply. And yet, as I talked about a couple of days ago, we got all mad at the companies that brought capital into producing new housing stock. So I guess I give up. Maybe the only thing you can do is just have government give people other people's money to go buy a home, as if the housing market would not then price that in. This was the criticism. And so in a way, he's doing the same thing Vice President Harris proposed. She said, let's give $25,000 to people to help them with their down payment. He's saying, let's give people a $24,000 tax credit. So they buy a home, they get a big tax credit, and then that essentially gets priced into the homes. And is it dollar for dollar? Maybe not. I recognize there's not total linearity there, but it's a very bad policy idea that is totally focused on addressing the demand side, doesn't do anything to address the real issue, which is supply side, and is rooted to a false premise that somebody else rigged the system against them. This entire financial crisis narrative that petrified me in 2009, 10, 11, enough to motivate me to write my first book, Crisis of Responsibility, has all played out exactly the way I feared. That it is kind of baked in. Rahm Emanuel wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post trying to be a more mainstream guy because he knows both right and left sides of the aisle right now are prone to believe, yeah, there must have been someone who rigged the system and screwed us, and now we got to make it all right. My friends, that is not how we're going to get a free and virtuous society. It's also not how we're going to get affordable housing. And because I want affordable housing towards the aim of a greater, a freer, more flourishing society, let's put to bed these bad ideas, bad premises, bad conclusions Rahm Emanuel talks about here in this op-ed, and let's seek a more cogent housing policy for the sake of young men who want a better life. Thank you for listening to David Bahnsen's Capital Record.